In terms of the why not, starting with like the story that you might tell yourself when you think about onboarding new volunteers. You might think that you don't have the time. Maybe you feel a little uncomfortable asking. Maybe there's a trust element of the whole, if you want it done right, you have to do it yourself. And sharing ownership is hard. These, might be stories that you tell yourself as you think about tackling the world that is volunteer engagement. And there might be a situation where you're right. And I do want to be real about like there can be a need that it ends up becoming more work than reward to have a volunteer do that. And we want to kind of help guide you all to really make sure that we are using volunteers in a way that makes sense, because maybe a volunteer isn't the best role. So what to look out for when you do have volunteers, be aware of when it is more work than reward. So one example of that might be there's a high demand tool that breaks and you're trying to kind of like get a tool fixer to come in and fix it. And then maybe that fixer, something comes up, they can't come. You go and you reach out to another person and you just end up spending all this time and energy communicating with others when maybe you could have even fixed it yourself in an hour and saved yourself that time. It's a high demand tool, you prioritize it and get it done yourself. But when you have 100 broken tools, maybe it actually is your best use of time to have a team of volunteers that can come in and tackle that. It's also important to think about risk. Representation, member experience is so important at a tool library. And when you bring more and more folks into positions of power, because yes, being a librarian is a position of power, right? That could be increased risk. So we're really intentional here around things like, mansplaining. We're really sensitive that if someone comes in and had a negative experience with a volunteer, it could actually keep them from borrowing tools in the future. And that is like really, really huge for us. So we have, different ways we can talk more about to make sure that our volunteers are representing us really well. And then reliability is big. Does the volunteer actually have capacity to show up in the way they want to? And also, who's holding the bottom line? Is it you as staff? If a volunteer gets sick and they tell you 30 minutes before their shift, really being real about your role as staff and if you're the one holding the bottom line is important. And then the last thing I wanted to make a note of is around boundaries, because it's a community project. Some of my best friends are librarians. It's really like a tight-knit community here, and I think that's common at a lot of tool libraries. But you want to be intentional. Do you want volunteers to be able to text you at any hour of the day? Probably not. So being intentional about your own boundaries when folks have access to you, how you kind of show up in that communal setting is also really important when building volunteer power.